Into the ballgame is Paul McKeskey, who's become kind of a cult hero in Milwaukee, Tommy.
Fred Roberts hits McKeskey at the other end.
That was all fucked up. That wasn't even our intro.
Right.
So what do you got for us today, Drew?
So what's Barkley's famous 2 words?
I don't know.
Paul and Nash must see TV.
Boom. That's it.
I'm about to get mine and it's about time. Call us Grindhouse, everybody in a house grind. I'm just doing me, I ain't trying to outshine. Trying to kill my vibe is how you get outlined.
So what's up, guys? Tony and Jules back this week for the Hoopstorians. Unfortunately, we don't have Hoops History with us today. So let's get right into it. Today in NBA history, August 12th, 2025. August 12th, 1950, George McGinnis was born. So happy late great birthday to George McGinnis, who unfortunately passed in December of 2023. So Tony, if I were to ask you George McGinnis and his impact from both the ABA and the NBA, what would you think about when you think about George McGinnis?
Well, I think a pioneer. I think the point forward position that he played in the 70s. If you read Bill Walton's book, Back from the Dead, he says that's really what changed the 1977 NBA Finals for them, was taking the ball out of George McGinnis's hand. You look at him in the ABA when he won the MVP, he was what, 30, 14, and 6 with like 3 steals, 2.5 steals. So I mean, in the there he was a statistical monster. Obviously, when he got to the NBA, things dropped, but he was still managed to be a 20 and 10 guy. I mean, guys like Amari Stoudemire were never a 20 and 10 guy. I don't think Sean Kemp. Yeah, Sean Kemp wasn't a 20-10 guy the entire time he was in Seattle. So that's what I'm saying. He had a couple good seasons after that, and then he started dramatically, dropping off. By the age of 29, he was clearly no longer the same player. So I think I think the history is the point forward thing, the ABA MVP. What do you think, Jules?
Yeah, I do think that George McGinnis is severely underrated, because when you think about McGinnis and Pioneer, you summed it up perfectly. Is that I think he's one of the true revolutionaries of how we think about point forwards in today's game, kind of being that all-around kind of guy, that Swiss Army knife that can provide and impact a team. I just think he gets somewhat looked past because the unfortunate short career that he has with the injury, and him obviously playing in the ABA. We mentioned him being an ABA MVP, and no one really talks about McGinnis like that. So I truly appreciate from being from Philly that George McGinnis was one of the guys that we still talk about in the city of Philadelphia, but not to the extent of what we really should be, and evaluating him as a pure talent for those late 70s Sixers teams.
Well, hey, that was this day in NBA history, man. So, Jules, you wanted to get into this, and you brought up the topic today. So I'm gonna let you lead off about where you want to take us on this this journey.
Yeah. So the impact of legacy stats, right? So on our platforms on TikTok, a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily understand how we look at stats, or how essentially they were formed in the evaluation of how we kind of look at box scores and stuff like that. And doing some research for myself, back in when the BAA and the NBA first kind of formed, they weren't necessarily tracking everything that we do today. So I actually forget the name, unfortunately, of the first what we probably would equivalent today's Finals MVP. I think he was giving you a legitimate 20 and 10, but the stats is just so limited to what we can view that people who like to just only box score watch would definitely just say, okay, this guy was the best in the finals. But they won't say, or they won't see somebody like a Bob Davies being an impact for winning, because of you would physically have to see him, right? And I think when we talk about impact stats in general, where should we kind of start? Where do we have to evaluate from the evolution of just points, 2 points and assists, 2 points, rebounds and assists, 2 points, rebounds, assists, blocks, et cetera, getting into what we talked about last week with Mr. Rom about defensive win shares, effective field goal percentage, plus minus, and stuff like that. So kind of breaking it down and then building it so we can all understand as a community, where should we effectively start when we start to look at impact legacy stats to winning. And I think that Tony would agree. I would say probably Bill Russell, even though unfortunately not all the stats are there, but you can still look at, defensive ratings at minimum and see that, okay, number one defensive rating, number one defensive rating, number one defensive rating, and so on and so forth. And then as soon as you leave, we mentioned before, they weren't really shit after. So maybe you can guide me for your thoughts on the evolution of what we can evaluate for stats and the impact for a team compared to individuals.
Well, I think the evolution, and all you need to do is look at, at least for 59 on, I think all we'd have to do is look at Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain's a guy that played for stats. He valued stats. And obviously he thought through stats, that's what was going to make him the greatest player of all time. That's why, he pumped out the numbers he did. That's why he was trying to get the numbers he was. He didn't know necessarily later on it'd be this ring culture and, things like that. So I would say, definitely back in the day, they valued scoring, and we still value scoring. Because you see nowadays, people will still argue that Bill Russell was the best player on that team because he scored 15 points a game. He averaged 15 points a game. And so I think scoring definitely will always be the major stat, because scoring is what decides it. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, the box score will say 102 to 100, and that's determines who wins. It's not the total rebounds, not the total assists, not the total anything, it's the total points. So I think the premium will always be on scores. I think that's where the evaluation of greatness will always start, and in for that matter. Now, I mean, obviously there's some blips and stuff like that. Yeah. When you see winning doesn't necessarily have to go through scoring. I think what I like doing is looking at, especially old players, is win shares. I like win shares. If we're doing advanced stats, very rarely do you get somebody that isn't a top player. I think 2010, for example, it's either 9 or 10. I think it's 10 though. Kobe Bryant doesn't lead in win shares in either regular season or postseason. Pau Gasol does. Everybody will clearly agree Pau Gasol is the second best player on the team. So when these blips happen, the second best player on the team gets it instead of the first best sometimes. And I just think things like that, like in 2020, LeBron James didn't win in win shares in the regular season or the playoffs. It was Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis is clearly the second best player. Some people try to argue that he's better, but that's what I'm saying. So I like to look at win shares when evaluating players, because then that kind of encompasses, like everything they do on the court, what's happening while they're on the court versus, what everybody else is doing. That's where I look at it. Where do you look at it when you look at it like that?
I think that I somewhat agree, but only to an extent, because we both, I don't know if you were with me, but somebody was to argue the specific wording of, I believe it was 2007, that Tony Parker, quote unquote, carried Tim Duncan in that finals. And when we do look at scoring, yes, you would say Tony Parker outscored somebody like Tim Duncan, but the win shares, like you mentioned, during the season in totality, lean towards Tim Duncan. And then on top of that, Tim Duncan has more total and averages more assists, rebounds, steals, and blocks than somebody like Tony Parker in 2007 in that final. So the argument was, just because a person values scoring so much that because I outscore you, that means I'm more valuable. And that's where something that I just can't get behind, because I test the advanced stats, the advanced metrics, understanding the game, all would lean towards, everybody would completely say that Tim Duncan was more valuable. Did he not have a good series? I think absolutely. That's a legitimate argument. But then you would have to argue, okay, what are the defensive coverages that Tim Duncan is seeing against the Cavs, who are top 5 defense and one of the best front courts defensively in the league that year, compared to what is being shown as the defensive coverages against Tony Parker. And that's where, again, the eye test needs to become encompassing. But we also both of us talked about this with somebody else about Steph Curry versus Kevin Durant in those later 10 years after, in 2016, 2017, or 2017 and 2018, I'm sorry, about those finals and the stats. So I know you wanted to talk about that for a short period of time. What do you have on those players?
So as far as the 07 goes, that goes back to my win share thing. So in the playoffs and in the regular season, Tim Duncan wins in win shares.
Yeah.
You look past the scoring, Tim Duncan, leads in blocks, steals versus Parker, assists, and rebounds. So, he gets them everywhere else as well. So for people to just act like Parker lapped him, no. Duncan had a poor scoring series, but I mean, other than that, he was fine everywhere else. I would still argue that he was the best player in that series over Tony Parker.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you factor in, so many people don't factor this in, when you factor in screen, you know what I mean? Like just screening just means so much to the offense. And when you have somebody good at screening, it just makes your offense so much better. Like we were talking about that, and I always bring up Steven Adams. I wouldn't want Steven Adams individually for offense at all. But for 5-on-5 where we run off screens, I want Steven Adams on my offensive sets, every play I can get him on because of how valuable he is with the screening. As far as the Curry Durant goes, I'm so sick and tired of hearing this argument. It's stupid argument. So when people try to say Curry is better than Durant, because look at the double teams and they ran their defense to shut down Curry on the double teams, right?
Right.
That would hold weight if the Cavs won. But the Cavs didn't win. So clearly the way to stop the Warriors isn't through double teaming Curry, because they beat you that way. And they beat you 4-1. So
right.
That's what I'm saying. I don't understand what their argument is. That was the wrong way. It wasn't our offense. Like looking at the Cavs offense, looking at like somebody like LeBron averaging like a 33-point triple-double, you're not like, oh, we need more offensive, output. These guys are trying. No, it was the defense. You wanted them to take about 10 points away from the Warriors' defense. So obviously the defensive package of shutting down Steph and letting Durant go one-on-one was terrible. We lost 4-1. We got swept.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we wouldn't do that. That's not the way to cover them, obviously, because if it was the way to cover them, we'd win. Our offense was fine. Mm-hmm. So obviously it looks like we should double team Durant and let Steph go off one-on-one, because this way doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're arguing to show. You know how he's better? Proved it by it not working. How the fuck did that prove anything?
Right. It doesn't.
It didn't prove shit. It proved opposite. It proved that if you let Durant go one-on-one, he'll lead you to wins. So I don't get that. And then like when people, like they keep arguing it, and I just keep going, you embarrassed yourself. Everything you're going to counter with now is just going to reinforce my argument.
Fair.
And they don't get it. And that's what I'm saying. So I take it you never heard it stated like that, but you got it right away. Why do people continue to argue that stupid shit?
And that's where I don't necessarily know, because I had to take a deep dive into it with a different conversation that we had with, or at least a conversation I had with somebody else. And again, the at least for 2018, I would definitively argue that I think Kevin Durant was clearly a better player. And I think it's just a weird argument, because it's strictly an eye test and defensive scheming argument about what the impact, what Steph gives you. And we do know now they physically have to coin a new term, gravity, to encompass what he impact to a team because they just can't say he's demanding more double teams compared to somebody else. They have to physically use the word gravity. So when we use that, Tony, how do you feel when people use that as an argument? And then how does that really lead into these legacy stats like we want to talk about?
I think first off, I think the term's stupid because it's not gravity anyway. It would be your gravitational pull.
Right.
That's not gravity. It's your gravitational pull. And then would you tell people that, then they go, they say along the lines of, well, you know what I mean? Or, you know what I mean? Like that. Like, it's not my fault you're saying stupid, incorrect shit.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's one. I think it's stupid anyways. Secondly, it's going to go into this like Kobe Bryant, the most double teamed ever player type of shit. You know what I mean? There's no way to determine it. We're not going to watch every single game of every single, you know what I mean, and see where you hesitate. Because to be honest with you, when I see Jokic kind of like semi-open, I would say the gravitational force of him where he freezes the defender, where they're not too sure to take Jokic one-on-one and pick up the coverage on him, or they don't, or they're, they want to play the passing lanes. I say that does more freezing than I've ever seen Steph Curry do. Because I think he's the best offensive player I've ever watched. Because when I factor in screening as well, he just has more options that Curry can't. So with that being said, yeah, I think it's going to go into one of those things like, Kobe's the most double teamed ever. Steph's got the best gravity ever. Yeah, but can we prove that? Can we prove that? Because I remember watching Shaq, in the early 2000s, it seemed like all five would collapse on him. Seems like he had a shitload of gravity.
As well as the stanchion, too.
What'd you say?
I said as well as the stanchion, too. He's got 5 people on him and the fucking backboard.
Yeah. So, I mean, so that's what I'm saying. So that's going to be one of those things that's going to be the eye test. That's going to be passed down from like father to son, grandfather to grandson. I don't think that's going to have that's going to be the lore of Steph Curry. But I don't think we're going to have any of these like numbers that back it up. Like, I think, I don't really know. Like, to me, like growing up, the all-time record was like the all-time scoring record meant something, and now it seems like since LeBron has it and, a lot of people dislike LeBron, now it seems like that record doesn't have anything. Let's talk about that. Like someone, who's younger than me, like how does like your constituents, feel about like someone having the all-time scoring record like LeBron?
It's funny you mentioned because I don't like it's almost talked in like passing, and it's not necessarily used as a point to determine LeBron's greatness. Mentioned before that I personally have him as my GOAT, but I go by tiers. But if I had to pick a person, I would pick LeBron. But no one uses it like they used it with Kareem for such a long time to use the longevity and use how that
to elevate
exactly. And I don't necessarily like maybe because I wasn't around, like you mentioned, I'm younger. I don't know if people were trying to quantify that with Kareem back in the day. I felt like it was probably one of the major talking points with him to elevate him when we talk about GOATs and just greatness in general. With LeBron, I rarely hear it. It's just a very subtextual argument that is just kind of crossed over to just like, yeah, he has that. Let's move on.
And see, I find that really weird because, that's the most like hallowed record you'd want in all of sports. If you could have any record, you want the all-time scoring record.
I agree.
Like as far as the individual goes. So, yeah, because see, when I was growing up, like originally as a kid, I don't know when the Kareem argument started, but growing up, it was always Wilt. Like in the early 90s, that's who you heard, Wilt. And basically it was like he was, mythological. He was Paul Bunyan, the shit he's done, the records, the feats, and I think that's kind of what and it was like winning was kind of secondary. Like he still won 2, as the man. So it's not like he didn't win at all. He just kind of went up against the greatest dynasty of all time. And, a team beats an individual, that type of shit. So I don't know. Like I'm somebody big on like the clubs. Like I think 20,000 points means something. I think if you have twenty
Right.
thousand points, you should probably be in the Hall of Fame. I don't really think there's an awful 20. The worst 20,000 point scorer of all time is, I don't know, Joe Johnson.
Yeah,
Antoine
it's around.
Jameson.
Yeah.
Something like that. And I think if you're, Antoine Jameson, like I said, he's a 20-10 guy at his peak. Like I said, Amari Stoudemire's first team All NBA, he couldn't get 20-10.
Hmm.
There's a lot of guys, that were, big time names that couldn't necessarily get 20-10. So I don't,
Hmm.
Bill Russell never averaged 20-10 while we're on that subject. So yeah, I don't know. Like me, that's what like separates a lot of these guys for me. Like I'm someone that's got like Moses Malone over Jokic.
Hmm.
Why? Well, they each got 3 MVPs. They each got a title as the best player. The difference is Jokic has got, whatever it is, 17,000 points. And, Moses Malone, if you count the ABA years, he's got 30,000, and
Right.
that's a big jump. I just think where do you take like these all time, like, totalities in, when you're evaluating players?
And just to mention again, because I'm one of these people who doesn't, I think, correctly contextualize it, but I try to use somewhat of the argument of contextualizing all time stuff, because I know we had this conversation a little bit before on my live, is that I think somebody like John Stockton gets overrated because of strictly where he is on all time assists and all time steals. And to where I do understand, because people will go back to the argument, well, you didn't physically watch him in person. Well, neither did most of the people, because during the time you would either have to go to every Utah game or live somewhat in Utah in the region. So I don't care about that argument. But my thing is where when somebody passes up somebody, let's just say Chris Paul is number 2 in both statistical categories, I believe, or if not in steals, he's at least top 5. Is that if we were to say Chris Paul somewhat were to overtake John Stockton in both the assists and steals, would we then classify Chris Paul as the greatest facilitator and the greatest defender of all time? I would say no. So where people need to start conceptualizing or understanding context behind stuff is that just because sometimes you have the record doesn't necessarily mean you're the best at it, but it definitely holds weight into an argument. But that's where I physically try to break down um, when people argue the totality stats versus the contextual stats.
Well, I think too, when you get up somewhere like Stockton and you're a two-time, you hold 2 of the records, and obviously those would be the most like point guardiest records too you could get out of the 5. Um, yeah, I think if somebody wants Stockton in the top 10 because of that, I think that's fine. I mean, I don't think that elevates over guys that were like winning and stuff like that. But if you were to say, hey, I'd rather have his career than Gary Payton's, you know what I mean? Something like that.
Fair.
Um, I think that's cool. I'll trade a defensive player of the year and a ring is the, 6th best player on the team for 2 all-time records. My name to be atop the record books. Um, and then I got to the finals more as a major player than you did, things like that. Like I said,
Mm-hmm.
it depends on where you want to put them. Like I said, I think having those 2 records for Stockton, especially when you get like, around to the 10th greatest point guard of all time, I think that holds weight. Um, at that, I break down my records on just what happened. I break it down into a subsection of, winning, especially winning as the best player on the team,
Mm-hmm.
accolades, stats, because those are all objective. I'd have to argue if you averaged 20, either you did or you didn't. Because that's what I'm saying. That's kind of like when we go into that gravity thing, well, how do I prove that? I
Right.
mean,
You
I could
have to
just say
physically
it.
watch. Right.
Right, right. But even someone, such as myself that has physically watched so many games, I'm not gonna be
Mm-hmm.
able to watch every game of every play of every, and as I break it down and analyze it. So I think that's where that comes in as well. Um, but yeah, like to me the numbers matter. Um, I think that's really what, like, you look at someone like Willis Reed, he's got what, 1 MVP, 2 finals MVPs. He's got great individual numbers. if he had something like 20,000 points and 10,000 rebounds, we'd be talking a whole lot different about him. But he only's got like 12,000 points and 6,000 rebounds. That's why we don't talk about him the same. And generally speaking, the longer you have bigger stats, the more years you're relevant. The more years you're relevant, the better the player, the better the legacy. But like some of these people, like, they just like the numbers don't matter at all. The numbers matter. You know what I mean? You want to know if somebody's averaging 20 or if they're averaging 25 or if they're averaging 30 or like, let me ask you this. If they didn't keep track of any stats and they just put up the scoreboard at the end of the game, how much would you like watching?
And not much, not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. Because I think that encompasses the I guess the biasness of some people when it comes to determining who a favorite player is because of their averages or how they're impacting the game. So a person's argument, if we took away the individual stats and just put up a box score at the end, it was like, okay, then it would become very literally like analytical. How are they getting their how are they scoring as much as they do? How are they playmaking as much as they do? How are they as defenders and so on and so forth? Which I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to it, but I think it would just look at the game of basketball completely differently compared to, okay, I can just look up what we just mentioned, like a Willis Reed who never averaged 20 and 10, who had a significant, who never got to the totality numbers as somebody else. And we can then quantify who he is. Same thing with Bill Walton, who had a shortened career because of the injuries. You have to go and quantify what he is because the amount of points scored in such a short period of time. And that's why he's a Hall of Famer, because his contributions and what he impacted for the game in the totality of who he was.
I've also noticed, too, as far as the number goes, I've never heard a numbers guy say, hey, fuck the eye test. But I hear a bunch of eye test guys say, fuck the numbers. And I've noticed that a lot of eye test guys, the numbers don't back up their claims. And that's where it like somehow comes into play. Why do you think so many eye test guys are against the numbers, but numbers guys are never against the eye test?
So I'll give you a good example of that. Is you've heard me with a couple of the takes I've had lately that I've been posting on TikTok, and I can see the stats of what somebody like a Larry Bird was doing, and so I understand the end result. I can understand the title, but I don't necessarily know the context. So I go back and look at these games and see, okay, why does in 1981 does he average 15 and 7? Okay, make my evaluation there. When a eye test person talks about the stats, it's because I think a lot of these people who are arguing about eye tests are super emotional, and they want to really be the person of who they're arguing, who their favorite players are. So they don't necessarily try to go to stats. They always go to, oh, well, you had to watch him to understand. Oh, you need to go and start to feel the same feelings I did, so you can understand the argument and so on and so forth. So that's where I just disagree, because even though we both have established our favorite players are completely different from everybody else's, the stats don't necessarily back up why they're our favorite player. We have our own feelings, but we won't put them into conversations that they won't or don't deserve to be.
Well, yeah, because not only that, like I look at some of my favorite players of all time, and like some all-time favorite players, Larry Johnson. He only had 2 good years before he got injured. And don't get me wrong, the stats are cool, but I mean, his best year ever is 22 and 11, which is a good year, but it's not going to like write anything. It's not going to be like, hey, he once averaged 22 and 11. I don't give a fuck. 50 and 25 is cool, but it ain't 22 and 11. You know what I mean? Like, it's good numbers, but it's every year somebody's doing those numbers. Yeah. And then on top of it, like, and then some of my favorite players are guys that just like overachieve. Like I used to watch somebody like Jared Dudley, especially when Jared Dudley was at his best version. I really like Jared Dudley. I really like 12.7 points a game, top out. Jared Dudley because he didn't really have any athletic ability, as far as NBA. He just really played the game smart, shoulders, put a lot of effort in it. He was a joy to watch. He didn't take plays off. He maximized his ability. He didn't make stupid plays. I just enjoyed watching it. So, but I'm never ever going to no, you got to watch him the way I watch him, and then you'll feel it. You know what I mean? Because I have,
Right.
I like to kind of watch it as a coach. Look at the way a coach does. I enjoy hustle play. I enjoy people maxing out. There's a guy named Cole Aldridge. We used to have Dave Severns used to be on here a lot. Former assistant coach, scout. He used to coach him. We both said we love that guy. We love that guy. That dude's like a 4.4 rebound, 16-minute a game guy. But he's awesome when he's on the court. He's just not worth that many minutes on the court. So that's what I'm saying. Why is it that you don't think people understand the separation? You know what I mean? Because I guess I don't have enough ego just because I think I like it means you're going to like it. Why can't people separate that shit, in your opinion?
Yeah, and that's I think the ego argument that we always kind of go back to is why people don't necessarily can accept another person's opinion, because I think we both live in a day and age now to where we're basically yelling at each other, not us, but just the community in general, is that, okay, your opinion is wrong because you're feeling that way. And we can disprove your feeling by the stats that back that up and so on and so forth. But they won't want to hear it because it's either one, their favorite player, or two, they have extreme bias. So it's where the people won't necessarily accept the stats or something that will disprove how they're feeling to be like, okay, let's bring, my favorite player down a little bit because the stats won't back up how I feel. So I'll biasly overrate a person because I feel such a way towards that player, how their game was, or something like that.
Yeah, but then it goes into, and this is what I mean by on the legacy. We see this all the time, with the Kobe fans trying to get him up into top 3 conversations, top 2, top 1. He just doesn't belong there. You know what I mean? And then you say people are hating on him. No, you need to keep him in that 8 to 12 range where he's really locked in at. And I would say on the wrong side of 10 over on the right side of 10, but hey, that's a different conversation for a different day. But what I'm trying to say is and nobody's hating, it's just honestly. You know what I mean? Most people, if they're going to pick the greatest career of all time, or top 3 career, and if you're in the top 3, you should have a really solid argument for 1. That's what got you to 3. You just don't really have no records of one MVP and led your team to 2 titles. You know what I mean? Maybe you did lead your team to 2 titles, but you got the most MVPs ever. You got the most records ever. Or you got the best statistical. Okay, you got somewhere, backing you up somewhere, and you don't have anything backing you up. And then the things that are valued, that you try to hype up, the more and more you dig into them, the more and more they look ridiculous. You know what I mean? One of the hardest runs ever in 2010. He didn't beat a single 55-win team. 50 to 54 wins. He had home court every year. You know what I mean? Cool, he did it. Not kudos to him, not knocking it. You know what I mean? But now when you start telling me it's the hardest ever, it's like when LeBron says, same shit. That bubble ring was the hardest ring ever. No, the fuck it wasn't. No, the fuck it wasn't. You had the exact same advantage as everybody else did. That's the most equalist ring ever. Not the hardest. What put you at a disadvantage? You were the same shit everybody else was. So that's what I mean. So I think when they start adding their emotions into it, and like I said, Kobe never said that. LeBron actually did say that. That's why people hate LeBron for saying shit like that. That's why people are going to dislike the Kobe shit, because you're lying. It's one big lie. And then as we toss it back to you, don't you want to be right on this shit? Just out of curiosity. You know what I mean? I would love to argue how Larry Johnson's the greatest player of all time. I'd look stupid.
Right.
I just look stupid. There's just no argument.
And I feel the same way. My favorite player of all time is Kawhi Leonard. And there's some, I can go on the tangent of his, 2019 run, and he had this all-time efficiency in 2021 in the playoffs. But, okay, he doesn't play enough games, and people value the durability of actually being on the court. So we won't be, or at least seems like you're in concern, we won't argue that our favorite players are going to be in these pantheon types of guys that legitimately have a conversation about being as great as they are compared to other people.
No, and that's what I'm saying. And it's like, and then here we go. Kawhi, he's got Finals MVPs, he's got Defensive Player of the Year, All NBA. He's got everything but an MVP. He's got it all, right?
Right.
And and obviously we see the winning and we see the games. You know what I mean? He's clutch. He's passing really kind of like his weakest thing, but I mean as he's gotten older, the years have gotten better on that. His shot
Fair.
goes in. It's the flattest fucking shot I've ever seen, but it goes in. You know what I mean? So I don't care how it looks. You know what I mean? His perimeter defense is really good. Everything about him looks really good. And then we go back to the only thing, and like I said, the games or whatever, but we wouldn't even notice the game so much if the totality of stats were there. If he had 20,000 career points, we wouldn't notice this nearly as much, but he's got 12,000 or whatever he's got. So that goes back into there. When do we really start admitting that we really value the totality of these players' stats? Why, like, people continuously try to shit on them. It just looks better that Reggie Miller, while only averaging 18 points a game, and it took him years to get into the Hall of Fame, he's got 25,000 points. I don't know if Reggie's in without 25,000 career points.
And that's a good argument too, because I do think that that's somewhat of a conversation that is slowly bringing up in our community, or at least what I've seen, is that what's the key value of a player, or the community when they evaluate players? Do they care about how long a person's been doing it, or how great a person can be doing it? And that's where the GOAT, Michael Jordan versus LeBron kind of goes in, because somebody's been doing it for 20 years. The other person's been doing it to 15 years, but that 15 years looks a lot better. Admittedly, like I said, I have LeBron as my GOAT, but that 15 years looks a lot better for quality over the quantity of somebody who's now in year 22, 23.
Well, wait, let me ask you this. When evaluating, says someone that's got LeBron, where do you evaluate all of LeBron's like crazy statistical accomplishments? The only guy with, 40, 10 shit, the only guy with 10, 10, and 10, in terms of, points, blocks, points, rebounds, assists, but he's got 40, 10, and 10. Where do you value that then?
I value that very highly. Like when I evaluate impact players and impact stats, I do personally, I try to look at the total stats, but when there's a person or a player that is being compared relative to era, depending on what the era is, I try not to go and talk about the totality, because I brought up I think a good example before of Bill Walton. Well, somebody who has 6,000 points can't compare to somebody that has close to 20,000 points, but Bill Walton in 3 years has a really good peak, winning an MVP and a finals MVP. So if he had longer longevity, we'd be talking about Bill Walton a lot differently. And I think you could probably be considered, even though I think the all-time center position is stacked. I think that he would be among one of those guys, absolutely. But because if we would go to the totality argument with Bill Walton, that looks weak compared to somebody like I mentioned, like a Wilt, or like even a David Robinson or a Moses Malone or something like that. So I think it's like the context does matter when you compare. But for me personally, I try to somewhat use the stats behind it, and sometimes I use the totality of their stats, but it's not my anchor to any argument.
No, I just think the totality matters. I think that what would be like, I know people like to compare LeBron and Kobe. You know what I mean? I think that when you look at it, I think the totality of the stats smashes them out. I think that's what actually gets LeBron in the argument with Jordan. He has the longevity, the more years. And it's really about what you value. Me personally, I would have Jordan over LeBron, because Jordan won more in a shorter amount of time. That's the greater accomplishment. Now,
right.
If you're drafting players from your franchise and you don't know who you're going to get, and you could get LeBron, an All NBA LeBron for 20 something years, I would understand picking that over. why, saying that I don't think you're going to reach the heights of Jordan, which I don't think he reached the heights, but, the long sustainability, the sustainability of it. I mean, I think LeBron probably was the best player in the league for 12 years. I think from 08 to 20, I think LeBron has a legit, argument for best player in the world. And, the numbers back it up. I am a big numbers guy. I think generally speaking, the numbers back it up. Do the numbers always back it up? No, not always, but generally speaking, the numbers are going to back it up. Overwhelmingly, if you score 30 points, that's going to be good than bad. Very rarely are you going to score 30, and that's a bad thing that we just did. So yeah, I think that's where that comes in. I think the numbers, I think the stats add to your legacy. I think anybody with a decent legacy, I think Bill Russell probably would have what people would consider as the worst stats to be considered the greatest player of all time. And he's got 15,000 points and 22,000 rebounds.
Right.
I think those are pretty good stats overall. I don't think, like I said, I mean, obviously, I don't think they're the greatest stats, but I think overall they're pretty good stats. Ultimately, do you think we're going to come to? Let me ask you this, because I don't think anybody's ever asked you this. Do you think there's a threshold to where, like, you're going to have bare minimum these stats to be considered the greatest, like in totality of all time?
See, and that's actually a really, really good question. I don't know, because of where specifically like Jokic and Giannis are when we talk about all-time greats for consensus. I don't know where they are for you when we talk about all-time rankings. But because they've both been actively
somewhere anywhere
playing,
from 15 to 25. The highest I can see you put them in is 15, lowest 25, somewhere in there.
And I would agree. But and this goes back to what I said before, like the quality over quantity, is that I think for like specifically somebody like Jokic, who I think has a top 5 offensive peak of all time, it gets hard to then argue against somebody who is putting up the quality of years of somebody of an offensive player like Jokic, and then tell me that when we talk about the story of basketball, we can't talk about somebody who doesn't have the totality of stats like everybody else. A 6'11" Serbian white guy who's European is being compared to other greats like Oscar and Jerry, and or is in somewhat of that same realm. And while he barely is touching them in points, he probably is around there with assists and rebounds and probably clears. But in the totality argument, that's where I find it so interesting, is where the value starts coming for individual. Do we care about how long a person's doing it, or do we care how great somebody's doing it, like I said before?
Well, so it depends. So, like with Jokic, like, who'd you give me an example? We'll just use Pettit, for example. Jokic and Pettit. I think having 20,000 points, 12,000 rebounds is more than the one extra MVP he has. Because, Jokic, I mean, he's like 4,000 rebounds behind and like 3,000 points or whatever the numbers are. An MVP is not worth 4,000 rebounds. It's not worth 3,000 points. Whatever the number is. We see MVPs what they're one at. About 2,000 points. That's how much an MVP is worth.
About, yeah.
2,000 to 2,500.
Right.
So that's what I mean. So that's really what's the separating is for me. But yeah, like if you got, like I said, if you're Bill Russell, I would say generally speaking, you're going to have to hit about 20,000 to be considered the GOAT in scoring, unless you've done something, that's also like crazy, is like, all the winning Bill Russell, because this game's always going to be about winning. I mean, I don't give a shit if you have 0 points. If you got the most rings and you're the main reason why that's happening, then you will always have an argument as the GOAT. I don't care what your stats are at that point. This game's always about winning, but it's hard to show impact on the court of being the best player on a dynasty and not having some statistical evidence that backs it up. I think those are what stops, like, for example, guys like Bruce Bowen, the difference between them and like the Michael Jordans. Bruce Bowen was really good at staying in front of his man, Jordan could stay in front of his man too, but Jordan could create turnover. Bowen can't create turnover. He
No.
can just stay in front of his man.
Yeah.
And that's why you see all these all defensive team and no like defensive players of the year and all that. So that's ultimately, I think, where the stats legacy goes is if you're a great player, the numbers are going to show that backs that up somewhere. Like even the ones that look like Bill Russell and they're like, he averaged 15 points on 44% shooting. Yeah, he also averaged 23 rebounds and 8 blocks.
Right.
Bare minimum, with 4 assists, over 4
Right.
assists, probably a couple steals. So he's great in every other facet of the game statistically. And you're going to hyper focus on this. And don't get me wrong, 44% is awful. I agree with that. 15 points, that's a legit third option.
Yeah, and what I because you heard me say this before, I find it so weird because we talked about advanced metrics last week. Everybody harps on field goal percentage, basically, really in the 60s, but we can still do our statistical research, and they've done the average true shooting percentage. It's free online of basically, I believe, until I think it was 58 was when they started, all the way up till now. So even if we go by relative true shooting or even effective field goal percentage, for majority of his career, Bill Russell is a net positive compared to league average. So he's still giving you better efficiency than the league average player. So again, I always find it weird when people bring up the 44% field goal percentage just with him. But when we talk about more, not necessarily even modern guys, I've even heard people use effective field goal percentage and true shooting for people like Kareem in arguments as well. Like, we can't use that for Russell too. I've never understood that.
Well, another thing that's crazy to me on that is that, Bill Russell did that, shooting like 13 shots a game, right? And
Right.
if you're gonna have somebody missing more than he makes, you're gonna want to take a lower field. But yet these same people that say fuck the numbers and fuck all that, then they'll harp on that with Bill Russell. But then we go back to the Kobe Bryant thing, you know what I mean? But with Kobe, it was fine. Well, Kobe's shooting 20 shots, shooting the same percent, but he's shooting them from 20 feet away. Don't give a fuck. They're still going in at the same amount of rates.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the scoreboard don't give a shit. The scoreboard doesn't go, oh shit, that's 20-foot shot and you missed. We're going to give you a little more points for the next one you make because of it. Doesn't care. So that's what I mean. It's like I don't care any negative stat. And see, that's another thing too. Any negative stat you have, like for example, Magic Johnson. Oh, well, he sucked at defense. Well, one, he was a really good defensive rebounder. You know what I mean? That's part of defense. But nonetheless, even if it didn't stop him from winning. I don't care what your stats are if you're winning. You know what I mean? If you're showing me a penchant for winning more than you're losing, such as like, a Magic, a Bill Russell, you know what I mean? In 12 years, you're making 9 finals, like someone like Magic. Bill Russell, you're winning 11. Then obviously your defense or your offense or anything like that, then I don't care about your stats because it's not stopping us from winning. Your stats are only supposed to be used as a negative, stopping us from winning.
And I agree, but you made me think of this, is that I find it funny, most LeBron fans, when they talk about the GOAT argument, right, is that, okay, if you value winning, they do like the silhouette thing, player 1, player 2, no names, no stats, and they use the totals. And it's always John Havlicek versus Michael Jordan, because John Havlicek, other than points, has more rebounds, assists, I believe, same, or maybe a little bit more steals. I don't remember. I'm trying to go off whim. But if you value winning, you would then value the context of, well, Michael Jordan is the best player on 6 finals teams. John Havlicek has an argument for, what would you say, like 3?
I'd say he's the best on 2. I'd say, to be honest with you, I think he's the best in 74, 69. And I think he does have an argument for 68.
Okay, so at minimum 2. And it's where the argument becomes, okay, do you value the winning, but the stats don't back that up, or do you value the stats and the winning doesn't back that up? And it's a weird conundrum of where when I have conversations with the people that I'm gaining these conversations with, is that I'm trying to learn how they evaluate and what they value and use it for future conversations and kind of like psychoanalyze them. So I know like, okay, I know how you value stuff. You're going against your value system. Why are you doing that? So on and so forth.
Well, really, the key is what I've learned is you have to take whatever their value system is and then completely throw it out the window, and then they're just going to kind of say whatever they need to say to make that point.
Okay.
That's really their value system, is every point I'm right because I'm me. That's what I've been noticing a lot lately.
The ego, yeah.
Yeah, every point I'm right because I'm me. It's really simple. John Havlicek, like I said, he's the best player on 2 title teams. I think there's an argument for 3. That's the difference between him and Jordan. One's the
Yeah.
best player on 6. One's the best player. I don't give a shit what anything else is. After that, and like I said, I looked into it for years. I think I had Jordan over. I had Russell third. And it took me years. Like what's stopping me really from Russell? I was like, there really is nothing stopping me other than like bullshit. Bullshit, predetermined shit, and like I just can't get down with that. I can't get down with pushing trying to have consistent logic. Like I said, the only one where it gets really different for me is pre-shot clock, because then I think the game is really different, being that you can hold the ball for an entire quarter if you want to.
Right.
The game could literally have 4 possessions possibly, and versus 200 possessions, and you can manipulate the game a lot easier off 4 possessions than you can 200. But
Right.
that's where I'm at. But no, I think total stats matter. That's what stops somebody from, like you said, Bill Walton or Willis Reed. Even a George Mikan. If George Mikan had crazy, 20,000 points and 10 with 5, I think people would look at him a lot higher as well. But since he came in, when the league came in, I think he was like 25, 26, 28, something like that. It just wasn't the same in terms of statistical dominance. I think anybody moving forward now to really get in that GOAT argument, top 10 argument, probably going to have at least over 20,000 points.
Well, my next question is, I'm a big believer in translating to the playoffs, or at least that's what I found out about myself recently. So somebody, because we both know several people that value the total stats, and we've talked about Wilt, and there's people who are torn about it because they just, their argument is just still going back to the regular season, giving you 15, 25. But with video physically being shown of Wilt, basically, like, it looked like an alley-oop, but he's basically grabbing a shot, taking it down, and putting it back up, and stealing shots from other people. And then when he goes to the playoffs, that 50 goes down to 37, that 37 goes down to 25, and stuff like that. Is there something where you think playoff translation matters to you, or do you care just more about getting the job done at the end of the day of winning a championship?
I care about getting the job done at the end of the day, but like, let's just look at some players that I know off the top of my head. Kobe Bryant's playoff translation stays the same, for the most part, but people value him as a killer because he's won some titles and that's associated with him. Wilt's legit the same thing, but he's called a playoff dropper and all that kind of shit. Tracy McGrady's playoff numbers rose from Orlando to the regular season. I mean, from the regular season to postseason. Nobody gave a shit because he didn't win. So that's why I think Wilt's playoff dropping is vastly overrated. And it's for the simple fact that he's a career 23 and 25 guy in the playoffs, I believe.
Yeah.
That's still more production than most everybody. At the end of the day, 23 and 25 is going to help you more than another guy that's not a playoff, like Kobe Bryant's not a playoff dropper. He's a playoff sustainer. He's 25 and 5. I'll take Wilt's 23 and 25. Just based on the numbers and the production that I know it will lead to, I will take those numbers off 25 and 5. I know 25 extra possessions on rebounding is going to help me out way more than 25, 5, and 5. Not to mention with the assists, the blocks, and all that. But that's what I'm saying. At the end of the day, like he had room to drop in 23 and 25. I would say probably by the raw numbers are still probably the best playoff numbers overall. and he can still lead you to 2 titles. And when he wins, he really wins because he sets the record each time he wins a title for most amount of wins.
For sure. Because we've had this conversation shortly before, is that in the value system that I have for the playoff translation, that's why I guess I tax people sometimes when they do have a longer sustained success than not, because it would be then harder to sustain yourself for a longer period of time. But that doesn't translate to production, and that production doesn't lead to wins. That's where I really have a hard time getting behind people. You heard me talk about Karl Malone before. You heard me talk about John Stockton before, and the fact that I think that basically I don't think that they translate to the playoffs really well, but their statistical dominance for the regular season is so good. But we also coined the term, the man doesn't deliver on Sundays, because of the clutch ability of Karl Malone. So where do you think that double-edged sword kind of starts when people have longer careers? Would you agree with that statement? Would you disagree?
Well, no. So I would go with it like we use Karl Malone, John Stockton. They didn't win. You know what I mean? So I'm cool with that. You know what I mean? If they're dropping and they're not winning, but like you look at, once again, we'll go back to Wilt Chamberlain. So Wilt Chamberlain, I think we would agree that his teams got progressively better, right? Like he started off with the Warriors, who weren't shit. You know, they went from Philly to San Francisco. Then he got traded to the Sixers, obviously with like guys like Cunningham, Greer. You know, those teams got better. And then when he got like West, Baylor, LA, you know, that was even the better team. Well, his playoff games go up. So the less scoring he's doing, he's on better teams. Obviously, it's going to go up. And or it's going to go down, you know what I mean? That's generally how that works. Well, it's something like, and I'm not sure what the number is exactly, but something like he's got 150 career playoff games. 80 of them are with the Lakers.
Right.
Well, you know, he's only averaging 12 points a game with the Lakers, but they're winning more. They're going to more finals. They're going to more Western. You know, they're winning more regular games. You know, he's winning more titles. So that's another thing I don't like about the Wilt thing, is they knock him for not winning, and then when he adjusts his game to win, that's what factors in a lot of these stats. You know, like he played more games in Philadelphia than he did, you know, with the Warriors. And that factors into his stats too. So that's what I'm saying. So the more winning he did, the more playoff games he played, which dropped his numbers. So that's how I look at it on that. So we're knocking the man for winning. When he adjusts his numbers to winning, we're still knocking the man. Well, you know, there's this perpetual loser built into him. And at the end of the day, he can lead you to as many titles as Kareem.
And I think that's a fair assessment, but how do you feel, like, again, then we have to kind of go into the micro of some kind of stuff, as we mentioned on the show before, the 3-1 lead that he unfortunately blows, or goes down in games, I believe 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can see a statistical drop, but by points. I don't think by rebounds, but his assists go up, and basically Hal Greer's leading most of the charge for the most part. I think in that game, I think it's game 5, Wilt Chamberlain has a really good game, but his assist goes up for the totality of those 4 games. Is that where
you're talking about 68, right?
In 68, yes.
Yeah.
Is that more of like the meat and bones of kind of some type of arguments? Because when somebody brings that up, you know, is that just too much of that, like one piece of evidence to go into when we talk about Wilt? Because I don't know.
It could be the piece of evidence, or I mean, it could also have the simple rebuttal. This is how we won last year playing like this. This is how I'm watching Russell win, you know, passing off to his guards and all that. So this is the formula that's been winning. You know, we're trying to stay with that formula. I don't know. I wasn't there. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I'm just saying that could be the argument too. But like I said, I think that we got these arguments on these players that they're, you know, that they're losers, or they're this or they're that. And that's what, like, you know, it's just nothing can be done, you know, at that. Larry Bird's given up a 3-1 lead. Kobe Bryant's given up a 3-1 lead. Steph Curry's given up a 3-1 lead. You know, we've had a bunch of players give up 3-1 leads, you know, but they're more associated with winning, so we don't count it that way and all that.
Right.
So that's my final thought on it because we're about out of time. You got anything else you want to add before we get out of here?
Yeah, I think as a community, we just need to do a lot better research in evaluating players and identify what you truly value, and just go and take deep dives, because I think Tony and I both stat guys, and we said it before here, is that most stat guys go to the eye test last, while eye test guys never use stats. So I'd much rather have the title in the back of the book with the context in the middle, instead of just arguing feelings. Because no offense, I don't really give a fuck about your feelings, and if it doesn't back up the argument, I don't care.
Yeah, because I could feel whatever. But hey, remember to bless the ones who broke you, because they're the ones who built you. That's Jules. I'm Tony. We'll check y'all next week. Until then, I don't know, do something.
Oh, Canada. Put on a suit, drink water, don't drink and drive. Hey, man, call your mother.
It means nothing. It means nothing.
No, they lying to you. It's about the money.
Now you're more fluent.